Mhm. All right, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Rolf Bienert here with the OpenADR Alliance. We're going to give it just another minute. People are joining in as we speak, so please stand by and we'll get started here in just a few seconds. All right, once again, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Rolf Bienert here with the OpenADR Alliance. It's one past the hour, so we'll just give it another 60 seconds for people to join, and then we will get started. All right, perfect. I see now 2 minutes past the hour, so I don't want folks to have to wait too long. So I would say we just get started here with the introductions, and then we hop right into the presentation. Again, Rolf Bienert here with the OpenADR Alliance. Thanks for joining today's webinar. And we have Spencer Borison from member company Codibly on the line here as well. Hey, Spencer, thanks for putting this together.
Yes, thanks, Rolf. Excited to be here.
And I think it's an interesting topic today. Of course, we'll learn much more as we go through these slides. But as many of you certainly know, California has been typically on the forefront of many things, demand response and flexibility over the years. In fact, OpenADR, in particular OpenADR 1.0, originated in California and already in the early 2000s. So a bit crazy to think about, but about 20 years ago. And there have been a number of regulations from Title 24 for commercial buildings and others that require OpenADR. And there are now new regulations coming out, and it's great that Spencer was able to review these and give our members and interested party here a little bit of an update on that. So if you go to the next slide, we'll just first do a little bit of housekeeping, quick intro again, and then I will provide just a very brief overview of OpenADR in case somebody has not heard much of it yet. And then I will turn it over to Spencer to really look at all the information that he could gather on that. After that, we'll have a Q&A session. If you go to the next slide, Spencer, we'll make then the Q&A session a bit more interactive, but we will do it at the end. So please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of the Zoom webinar tool. It's a little question mark in a little, I guess, text box. So you can type your questions in there and we will go through them at the end of the presentation. If we don't get to your question, we will do our best to afterwards review them and get back to you. Of course, the webinar will be recorded as well, and the slides and the recording will be posted on our website. We have a website that lists all the previous webinars, so you can go there through openadr.org. There's a quick link on the right-hand side of the home page, and here the link is also shown on the page. Everybody is in listen-only mode. There is currently no way for you to unmute. We want to avoid too much noise and background here. And as we said, we will get to the questions later in the webinar. So let's go ahead, Spencer. Just a quick info here. If you want to reach one of us, Spencer has his contact on there later. Don, Shen, and I are always available to answer any questions. Pretty simple email addresses here, just first name and openadr.org. All right, next slide. Okay, so as already mentioned, Spencer is on today here. He's the US lead for Codibly, and Codibly has also been instrumental in creating the new OpenADR 3.0 test tool, which in fact will be published for members to purchase very, very soon. I expect the next couple of weeks. And his focus has been on demand response and grid communication and many other standards. So he's a valuable resource, and we appreciate his research here today. So next slide. Okay, Spencer, quick intro from your side.
Yeah, happy to give a quick introduction just for a minute. For those that have not heard of Codibly, we operate as a consultant and software development partner and a technical integration partner to a lot of the folks that exist within this ecosystem for demand response and demand flexibility. So we've been in the market for over 13 years, have a global team of actually closer to 1,700 people across the world in our different offices, and do a lot of our business between the European market and the US and North American markets. So we are a partner to the OpenADR Alliance and help OEMs to understand the OpenADR standard and also to implement the full requirements for 2.0b to become compliant for the various purposes and utility programs they're looking to participate in. And then we also work with other players within the ecosystem, partnering with key aggregator players like Energy Hub to also act as their technical implementation partner for the purposes of enabling demand response and for empowering different OEM players across many different device types to be able to participate in demand response at the utility level and at the wholesale level. So we're really excited for this webinar. We think the pool controls devices are sort of an emerging market here when it comes to demand response, and a valuable one. So excited to talk a little bit more about that. And like Rolf mentioned, as folks have questions, please do ask those in the Q&A function. And we have some good time dedicated towards the end of the webinar today to answer any of the questions that pop up. So I'll stop there, and Rolf, back to you.
Thank you, Spencer. On the next slide. So I'll keep this really, really short. Again, I think, just looking down the participant list, I think most of you know what OpenADR is, but just in case, so we are all on the same level here. OpenADR, also known as the IEC standard 62746-10-1, which is OpenADR 2.0b, is a communication protocol, typically between a utility, a DSO, or an aggregator, or generally speaking, a DERMS, a distributed energy resources management system, at the top end, and the resource on the bottom end here. The individual connections are always between the server and one endpoint, and in pretty much most cases that I'm aware of, are transported through regular internet connectivity. In some rare instances, maybe also through dedicated cellular networks and things like that. If you go to the next slide, just a little more granularity here. So what we call the virtual top node, or VTN, is essentially the interface in the DERMS. So with other words, the utility, again, or aggregator, whoever runs it, has to have a resource management server to know where to dispatch signals, where to send prices, things like that. And basically, it connects then with the virtual end node, essentially a web client towards the customer who can receive these events. We're not going to go in much detail here on the signals, but the main service is what we call the event. which is similar to a calendar notice, start time, end time, with a lot of content in there, different signal types from prices to energy messages and other information elements here are possible. So if you go to the next slide, just a quick note here. We have been working, as many of you know, on OpenADR 3.0. Really the key difference there, it's a REST API in JSON, something that has been asked for many times over the years, as compared to XML, which is 2.0. But by no means does that mean that 2.0 implementations will go away, because there's a number of programs out there across the US and also globally that use 2.0 already. So 3.0 is a good add-on for additional programs, a bit more flexible programs and things like that. So if you go to the next slide, just quick notes here. We also support the EcoPort certification by now, but a trademark actually. So I guess we need to change this. I just see it here. And EcoPort is the certification mark for CTA 2045, the modular communication standard from the CTA. And it is a physical port, as you can see here on the picture, two form factors. Top right, little slide-in module that runs with DC voltage, and bottom left in the picture, you see the schematics here of the slightly bigger AC version, which takes AC power from the appliance. It's required for heat pump water heaters in the Pacific Northwest. And we have been starting to get certified products in now since a couple of years. So interesting standard for you to look at, in particular also in the context of today's discussions about appliances and things like that. If you go to the next slide. Just a few products here on EcoPort to give you the idea. So we have modules and then things like water heaters and appliances that can have it. You find that on ecoport.openadr.org. The next slide. So turn it back to Spencer, to the actual topic for today. I don't want to steal much of your time here. So Spencer, take it away.
All right, thanks, Rolf. So I'm hoping to treat this webinar in a way of a bit of a filter, where I'll start at a very high level. So I assume for some people this will be a bit basic in the first few slides, but drilling a little bit deeper with each slide and hopefully getting to some of the nitty-gritties by a few slides later than now. And then, like I said, would like to also take any questions that folks have, and we'll do my best to answer those. And certainly, as we're not able to answer any specific questions or we can't get to them because of time, we'll make sure to do our best to follow up with you in the coming days. So I'll start at the high level. Like I mentioned, the California Energy Commission. So what is the California Energy Commission? The commission is the state's primary energy policy and planning agency. So they're in charge of a variety of different things related to the energy landscape in California. They help with renewable energy adoption and standards to promote the adoption. They work on grid resilience, energy efficiency, and supporting climate goals across the state of California, which are some of the most progressive and industry leading in the United States and for much of the world, to be frank. They work also on some of these appliance and building standards, and that's what's particularly of note today. So for today's conversation, they work to enforce appliance efficiency regulations like Title 20, which is a bit separate from today, but is sort of in this interrelated world of efficiency standards. And then they also enforce this flexible demand appliance standard, FDAS, you'll hear it many different ways, which was authorized by Senate Bill 49. And that's of particular importance to today's conversation. So moving along here, and like I said, sort of drilling a little bit more deeply with every slide. So here you've got the background for Senate Bill 49. So Senate Bill 49 was basically what authorized this FDAS, the Flexible Demand Appliance Standards. In 2023, the California Energy Commission created what we're considering the first in the world flexible demand appliance standards that particularly apply to residential swimming pool controls. So I'll go into some other details about the different device types that may be covered in the future and that the California Energy Commission is currently working on to roll out to different devices in the future in the coming months and years. But for now, they've started with what they're saying is phase one, sort of not necessarily using that nomenclature, but certainly this is the initial phase, and the initial approach is to work with pool controls. So basically what this means is that there's a set of standards, which I'll go into in the coming slides, that pool control manufacturers need to be able to meet and need to be certified to have met to be able to continue selling in the state of California. So just to reiterate, there is a date, which is September 29th, 2025, so not too distant future, where all manufacturers of pool controls who would like to continue selling new devices manufactured at or after the date of September 29th, 2025, must meet this flexible demand appliance standard criteria to be able to continue doing so. So that's extremely important and will have large ramifications on the energy system and the grid resiliency for the state of California. To reiterate that point, there are over 1 million pools in the state of California, which in my research, I was actually surprised there were even that many. But really what that means is that it's a huge opportunity to be able to group different resources and to allow for better demand flexibility across periods of peak demand, which will help to improve the resilience of the electrical grid and also to shift some of that peak load to times of lower demand to allow for less capital intensive transmission upgrades to facilitate new generation by using some of the existing capacity that already exists within the grid, and also avoiding having to rely on more polluting peaker plants, for instance, that need to turn on quickly to meet those periods of peak demand. And so hoping to also avoid some significant amount of carbon emissions throughout that process as well. So moving on a little bit more deeply now into the requirements that are set forth based on the Senate Bill 49. So like I mentioned, September 29th, 2025 is the key date here as it pertains to this webinar when we're talking about pool control manufacturers. So in order to continue selling devices that are manufactured after that date, they will need to be able to meet these standards. And what these standards are, it's fairly broad in terms of the different certifications that are accepted as a part of this. Basically, they need to meet some certain criteria, which I do have in the next slide. And some of the key standards that we believe will be most relevant here for manufacturers to consider are the following, and they're on this slide. So OpenADR 2.0b, of course, is one of the key standards that we believe will help and have confirmed with the Energy Commission will be accepted as a part of this implementation. There are others. There's another called IEEE 2030.5. It's a more expansive standard, actually, and is quite complicated to implement, but does cover some other types of devices as well, similarly to OpenADR for controlling devices like inverters for battery storage. So depending on what the manufacturer, I guess the scope of the products that the manufacturer manufactures, that may be something to consider. And then there are some others as well that are not listed here that you can find in the appendix if you look at some of the documents that we've provided in the appendix there. But these are some of the key ones. And basically what is needed from the commission is that there would be the ability to receive and send commands back and forth between the utility, which would act as the virtual top node, which Rolf talked a little bit about, this VTN, VEN interaction, and that it is the ability to receive those commands and to be able to facilitate some change in behavior to allow for reducing the demand on the grid during those times of peak flexibility as communicated by the utility. So basically what this would mean is being able to shift and schedule when those pool pumps are running or when other pool equipment is drawing energy from the grid to be able to make sure that it's not during the time when the grid is most strained already. So briefly, just some examples. It could be things like being able to have the functionality to automatically be able to program not to run during a 4 to 9 p.m. peak when people come back from work and the demand on the grid is higher. or alternatively that it should run when solar abundance in the state is highest, what's often called the duck curve, which is between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. So just wanted to note that. A little bit more here now, as I said, continuing to drill down. You'll see here on the right some controls as they're defined by a recent webinar that the commission held that could be potentially covered by this standard. But basically, they'd want there to be a variety of different operational abilities here. So being able to have a default operational schedule, like I mentioned, that can run during those low emission or off-peak times when solar abundance is highest. So being able to have a fallback schedule, also the option to be able to connect to an aggregator like an Energy Hub who could help to control some of the dispatch of these signals, but certainly that's not a full requirement, but it is enabled by implementation of certain standards like OpenADR 2.0b. It would also allow for local overrides so that in specific instances, homeowners or installers can shift the times that are in that pre-defined fallback schedule to be able to accommodate specific usage or maintenance events. And then it would also be able to respond to event-based pausing, as it's called, which is basically reducing consumption during urgent, immediate, acute grid constraints. And then there's also some additional requirements, which I would urge folks to take a look at around the ability for wireless connectivity and to be able to validate that wireless connectivity is achieved with those devices. Also, there's a consumer consent function and requirement, which basically means that the consumer has to, for data privacy concerns, be able to authorize the gathering of any data and utilizing that to help make optimization decisions on their behalf about when to use the electricity from the grid. So there has to be a custom, consent from the customer. And also there's some additional cybersecurity protections to make sure that that data is protected and can be used most effectively. So a couple more things to note here. So the pool controls is, like I mentioned, the first device that is going to be covered in the requirements that will continue to evolve and grow under this FDAS, Flexible Demand Appliance Standards. But the commission, I actually just talked to them on Friday. They're actively working on a variety of other standards that will cover different devices in addition to the pool controls. So this might be increasingly relevant to a variety of different manufacturers. One is thermostats. Another is electric vehicle supply equipment, often called EVSE, and water heaters. Those are all being worked on in parallel. The latest word from the commission that I talked to some of the stakeholders from was that there's no set date for when these are going to be completed or in which order they will be released, but that they're all being worked on in parallel right now. So you should expect sometime in the coming months, there'll be some more updates and some more information there. And it's probably something for manufacturers who've not already met some of these communication protocol criteria to start to think about earlier on rather than waiting for next year. And one note here is that there is a listserv option, a subscription on the California Energy Commission webpage that you can subscribe to. It's free and easy to sign up. I did it myself, where you can stay updated with any updates in terms of any of these different standards and the progression of those standards or changes in any requirements and any other postings. So I would highly recommend, and that was the official communication from the California Energy Commission as well, that that's the best way to stay in touch with what's going on. And one thing I did want to clarify for those that have not seen it in the question and answer from Sean Stephenson. So yeah, so basically he clarified to add the standard is that pool controls manufactured on or after September 29th are what's covered here. So I do want to make sure that that's clear. And so thanks, Sean, for that. And like I said, if others have questions, please do add them to the chat and we'll continue to go through this after we get through a few more slides. So one other thing to note, in addition to those three other device types that I've mentioned, the CEC also has plans in the works further down the line to incorporate other types of devices. battery energy storage systems are what they're also thinking about. And they've also been exploring, although not necessarily committed to, potentially looking into applying these to clothes dryers or dishwashers as well in the future. So that's also something to think about. But for the purpose of this webinar, the pool controls is what is currently the active standard under which different manufacturers need to start to act now to meet that September 29th, 2025 deadline. And some of these other devices will be coming in the future. And just a couple other things to note. California is not the only market where we're seeing something like this happening. Certainly, it's probably the most concrete and the most specific to pool manufacturers. But there are other states like Washington and Oregon that require EcoPort, like Rolf had mentioned, which is the CTA 2045 OpenADR collaboration certification for water heaters to be sold in those states. That's currently an active standard. And New York State is also actively considering a standard very similar to what's happening in California and what's happening in Washington and Oregon State, which would also be quite transformative, as that's the largest market on the East Coast for a lot of this stuff. So just something to think about. We're seeing some states being progressive here. It's not just California, but certainly California, as all of us know, is an industry leader here. But other states are also starting to think about this as well. So a couple more slides now on a little bit from a manufacturer stakeholder perspective, because ultimately that's who's most directly going to be impacted in thinking about how to best work out how to follow with some of these compliance regulations. So I've got a slide that talks about these steps that you should be taking from a very practical perspective to make sure that you do meet the requirement by September 29th. So a couple things here, and really the message is you should begin planning now. This is not something that's just a flip of a switch. It does take some planning. It takes some implementation of software to allow for the controls and the connectivity with the grid to receive those communications. And that's going to take some time. It's not an immediate change or an opt-in to a specific notification service. So just to say that this is something to start thinking about if you haven't already, pretty much as soon as possible. So a couple steps to follow. One, assess whether your equipment currently meets these requirements. Of course, that's the first step. If you already have OpenADR or a similar standard implemented, then that's great. You're already pretty much meeting that requirement then. If you don't, though, which I think is the case for a lot of OEMs in the space, that's something that you're going to need to do to continue selling into California. Step two, there's a variety of ways that you can meet the needs for compliance. I've got another slide that goes a little bit more into detail in the following slide here, but it's really considering the trade-offs between building something from scratch yourself or leveraging one among many different pre-built solutions that already exist in the market to meet one of these protocols, like OpenADR, like IEEE 2030.5, or something similar. So really, it's an evaluation based on the urgency on your side and also the capacity and internal expertise of your team, because this is fairly technical and certainly can be learned, but given the time frame of about 6 months, something worth considering whether your team has the capacity to take on this project or it would make more sense to license a product that already exists. Step three, build a development schedule to achieve that certification. Certainly, if you decide to pursue OpenADR Alliance certification, we would recommend trying to meet the full requirements for OpenADR certification no later than the end of August to allow yourself to have several more weeks to complete any final steps that are necessary to join the membership of the Alliance, get listed on their approved products page, and also then confirm that you've met the full requirements with the California Energy Commission. I do have a small outline of what that's going to look like that I can go through as well, and did get a question about that before the webinar started. So I'll also talk briefly about that. But there are a few steps and back and forth with the commission that may just take several weeks. So it's not something that I would say you should submit on September 29th. It's probably something you need a little bit of lead time for. And then finally, begin the development of the necessary solution or begin the contract negotiations to license that necessary solution to achieve what you need here to become compliant. And like I said, so a little bit here in terms of compliance. So when it comes to deciding whether to build this from scratch or to leverage a pre-built solution, many of these protocols have been used for many different types of development across different devices in the past. So there are different solutions that exist out there that have already been built and tested and certified with the OpenADR Alliance or with different testing labs for IEEE 2030.5. So it's not that you're required to build it from scratch, but certainly if you do have the team capacity, we've typically seen the development time can range, and it sort of depends how many resources and what the expertise looks like on your team to complete all the steps required here. It can take as long as 4 to 6 months, frankly, to build the full requirements, especially if you pursue IEEE 2030.5 and its full set of use cases. It's quite expansive. For the purposes of this standard, you probably don't need to go through all the use cases, but certainly there's a lot of complexity to some of these standards if you've not ever looked at them in the past. And so I would definitely budget several months of development time if you're going to go the from scratch option. And that's assuming that you already have some level of telemetry gathering and the ability to control devices through some sort of cloud service within your cloud architecture already in place, which is typically what we consider like a phase 0 for being able to begin the development of those standards. So just to say, build in some time. Start early if you're going to go through this pathway, because you're only about 6 months out now. So getting started as soon as possible is highly advantageous to de-risking that you will be able to meet the requirements necessary by September. And one other time constraint to think about, for some of these standards, there is the requirement to be certified by a third-party testing lab. That can also take several weeks. We've done some projects with IEEE 2030.5 implementation, and while the test labs are highly trusted partners and very reliable, they do take several weeks to process the results. So it's not, again, something that can just be submitted and it's finished. Again, it takes a little bit more time. So just all things to think about when you're thinking whether this is going to be a quick process. There are a lot of steps along the way. So certainly can be done, and perhaps the cost will be lower depending on what your internal team looks like. But that's just things to consider. And then in terms of pre-built solutions, there are a variety in the market. Most of these solutions will offer some combination of a more SaaS service where you license the model and then get access to that license. And it's a very limited access, and basically it meets the certification requirements in a pretty accelerated fashion. Certainly, if you're interested, we can talk about that based on some partnerships that we have. I can certainly refer you to some potential companies like that. And then Codibly offers something that's a little bit more advanced, which would be a full license to the full code base for the implementation for OpenADR or IEEE 2030.5, which means not only can you meet the requirements for this standard, but as you're thinking about how to leverage some of those investments to integrate with other types of players that can potentially benefit your customers in the future around demand response, like an Energy Hub, like an Uplight AutoGrid, and like others that offer value to flexible demand resources and DERs in the space, you can also use the code base for that integration. So it's all a bit of a strategic conversation internally to decide whether it makes sense to go alone from scratch, to go with more of a simple implementation of a licensing, or to go with something that's also quite fast, but is a little bit more expansive in terms of the strategic priorities. So I think it really comes down to what you're hoping to do in the future when it comes to demand response. If you more want to comply and check the box, there's certainly options pre-built for that. But if you want to also think a little bit more strategically about how to expand this offering in the future into different markets, that's also an option as well. So we can talk through that with your team if that's of interest. And typically those solution implementation times are somewhere in the 4 to 8 week range, depending on the standard and depending on what your team has set up internally. So it's certainly lower risk in terms of timeline, probably does come with more upfront costs. So also things to consider. And in some cases, these standards are, or these implementations are pre-certified. For the example of OpenADR 2.0b, the certification is granted in some cases based on an existing license, and it can be basically expedited in terms of certification. I won't go too much into the detail there, but just to say that it's typically a little bit faster. So that's just a little bit more food for thought in terms of the options you have for compliance. As we're coming to a close here, I've gotten a couple questions in the Q&A, and like I mentioned as well, I got 3, 4, 5 questions before the webinar that I'll also walk through. But as you have other questions, please do let us know in the Q&A function in the Zoom link, and you should be able to continue asking here. So a couple of things here before we jump into Q&A. We've got some helpful links that the California Energy Commission provided me when I talked to them on Friday, and that we've been referencing in putting this presentation together. First is the main landing page where you can find all the documentation on pool controls and the proceedings and the materials related to the standard, as well as on the right side of that page, you can subscribe to the listserv, which I mentioned is where you can get the most up-to-date information from the commission to help to stay informed about any changes in the proceedings, as well as additional devices that will be covered under this flexible demand appliance standard in the future. And then the second link here is the final ruling text. So it's from Westlaw, and it's the finalized version of the standard and the regulation, so that you can dive into the details of some of the requirements and ways that you can meet them. That can be relevant if you're thinking about planning out how do we consider implementation and how do we evaluate from scratch versus using a partner pre-built solution. And then I have linked the OpenADR Alliance, their webpage, as well as Codibly's webpage, if there's an additional investigation and interest in having a follow-up with either of our teams. So with that, I will switch to Q&A. Like I mentioned, I've gotten a couple in the chat, and then I also got some before the call started. So I think I'm going to start just in order of chronology of receiving these questions with some that I received before the chat, before the webinar, I should say, rather. And then we'll dive into the ones that we're receiving in real time. So please do feel free to add on if you have additional questions. So the first question that we got was, I'll paraphrase a bit. Basically, how will compliance with California's SB 49 be verified and enforced? So the CEC has a certification database to be used for flexible demand compliance. So all model numbers for devices in scope of the regulation manufactured on or after September 29th, which is an important clarification here, and something that Sean had also mentioned in the chat earlier on in this webinar. All of those devices must appear as certified in that database by that time for lawful sale in California. So non-certified pool controls manufactured on or after this date, which is September 29th, 2025, may be assessed a monetary penalty per device, per manufacturer. So the penalties can become quite steep if you sell many devices after that date out of compliance with this standard. So definitely something that is important here. The second question that we got before the webinar, so basically it was asking, there's a bit of a distinction in the industry between pool controls and pool pumps. So the two different sides of this pool generation and management here. And it was asking whether those are considered the same under this regulation. And it's important to note that there is a similar standard. I mentioned it in one of the slides, which deals more with building energy efficiency regulation, which has covered for already several years pool pumps being managed under that energy efficiency standard. So those pool pumps should already be certified under Title 29 at this state. If they're not, that's certainly something to investigate immediately. So you wouldn't need to recertify under Title 20 for those pumps. They would already be covered. But then you would need to separately certify your pool control devices under the FDAS standard. So really, you're looking at two different standards here. Likely, you've already done Title 20 because that's been out in the market for several years and has already been actively enforced. But then this FDAS applies to the pool controls as well. Third question, and I think actually for one of these questions, I'm going to share my screen because there was a bit of a diagram that I got from the commission that I think might be helpful. That'll be the fourth question here, looking at my list. So the third question is, from an OEM perspective, are manufacturers responsible for any registration or help basically supporting the enrollment of homeowners in these demand response standards? Or are they really just responsible for making sure that the specific regulations outlined in this standard are being met. So the answer is no. And I guess just to make sure that's clear, they're only responsible for the standard being met, not for helping to enroll homeowners or helping with adoption or participation in the programs. The enforcement office will, however, look at anyone along the sales chain who interacts with these devices and can hold anyone along that chain responsible if there are devices that are not compliant that are sold after the date that this goes into effect. So that could mean the manufacturer. It could also mean the contractor or wholesaler. So just something to think about, that it's not just the manufacturers here that are on the hook to make sure that these devices going out into the market are compliant, but it's anyone who may be the end seller who's actually going to be putting that unit to the customer. And like I mentioned, there is a monetary penalty here. I was quoted 2,500 per model per unit. So just something to think about, and it's highly important here. And I think the last question then that I've got, and I'm going to try to see if I can share this. And I think actually for the purposes of this, I'm not going to share it because it might be challenging with the screen, but I'll make sure it's included in the deck. This image that I got from the CEC, basically they asked, and I referenced this, that in addition to making sure you're meeting the certification from someone like the OpenADR Alliance or a different agency with a different standard that would help meet these needs, you also need to meet and be verified by the California Energy Commission and be put in that database that I mentioned for flexible demand compliance. So the process there is something that takes a few stages. So basically, you're going to submit your appliance data to the commission. So that would take the form of verification that you've met, perhaps taking the example of OpenADR, that you've been added to OpenADR's certified products list on their webpage, and that you've met the full requirements for OpenADR 2.0b. You would provide that data along with any supplementary data to the commission. And then this would be considered the first stage validation process. Then the commission would send whoever submits that data an email confirming that they have received that information, and will give you a reference number to track your submission. Then we're going into what they're calling the second stage validation. And I guess before we jump there, the commission would also let you know if you've missed anything in terms of the data you need to provide or the format of any of that data. So that's really what we're talking about when we say first stages. It's more of just a sense check to make sure everything looks right before they start to review it for accuracy and full compliance. And then we hop into stage 2 validation, which is that they're going to be processing that. And after the time that the commission takes to review this, you will receive a second email after that second stage validation with 3 potential outcomes. One is successful, which is, of course, what we're working for. Second is partially successful, which would provide some information on what was missing that would have allowed you to be fully successful, so that you can make some changes, or unsuccessful, which means that you've missed significant portions of the requirements here. So those are the 3 potential outcomes. And that's the basic process. Assuming you would be successful, then you would be basically meeting the full requirements here, and you would be added to that database where you would now be compliant to continue selling your devices. So Rolf, I'm not sure. I think you've been probably keeping a better eye on the question and answer. Any questions you think are most important to start with here from the list?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you very much, Spencer. That was really, really informative here, and good to know these requirements. So we have, I think, about 5 minutes left. So, but I think we should, so far, maybe make it through these questions. We'll see. An interesting one from Mansi is that, with this regulation, is it assumed that the devices, so the pool pumps, are actually connected to the internet? So would that mandate that the end user needs to have Wi-Fi, for instance, to connect these devices to the cloud and get events and so on? So not sure exactly if you can answer this question, but what's your thought? What's your take on it?
Yeah, I don't have a great answer here, and I'm sorry about that, but I think the information that I've received from the commission, and certainly can follow up, is that there is a requirement for wireless connectivity to be compliant as one of the, and I have that in one of the slides. Maybe I'll hop there if I can find it quickly. Just in terms of, yeah, so you'll see here on the slide that there are additional requirements allowing for wireless connectivity here, as well as what I was mentioning around customer consent and cybersecurity protections. The additional details there can be found in the regulation, which I've linked in that helpful links slide. So I'm not sure, and I don't want to misspeak, so I'm going to leave it there. But hopefully, through some of the documents that we've provided, the materials, that can be easily addressed.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, also from my end, yeah, I guess we need to assume that there needs to be connectivity. Otherwise, it would not be possible to receive
Yeah.
commands. There could certainly be, as you already also mentioned, an external controller. So we're not necessarily saying that the pool pump has to have Wi-Fi built in, right? So there can be a controller connected, which ultimately then connects to maybe also a home energy network or other systems via
Yeah,
Wi-Fi.
and I guess, Rolf, just to add on to that for just 10 seconds, I think the important distinction here that I just want to hammer home, I think I've said it probably several times already, is this standard is specifically related to the controls. So it is those interfaces, whether it's a control panel or it's an embedded port, like you had mentioned through the EcoPort standard or something related to that, or it's on the mobile application that controls the pool pump. It's not specifically designed for the pool pump itself, but rather for the
Yeah,
control mechanism, however
exactly.
that takes the, whatever form factor that takes.
Yeah.
So just to make sure that's clear.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Yeah. Question from Aaron here. Is there a freely available development tool that allows a developer to simulate a VTN to drive one's VEN firmware and to determine if it conforms to the OpenADR 2.0b standard? So I can take that, Spencer. Should be fairly quick. So, there's of course a lot of VTNs out there with utilities and others, and some utilities used to have a test access, and also some of our members used to have test access to VTNs. But the problem has always been that the maintenance of these, becomes cumbersome after a while, because there's just a lot of service requests as well on these free tools. However, there are a few things I can mention here. So first of all, there is open source code available for OpenADR 2.0b from the Linux Foundation, Open Leader, OpenLEADR, so Linux Energy fused into the name there. So this is not necessarily a full development tool here, but you can get both VTN and VEN implementations there. And then one somewhat limited, but still, I believe, available tool is from a company called GridFabric, gridfabric.io. They have they're one of the companies, that Spencer alluded to earlier, that have a stack and so on that they sell. But I'm pretty sure you can actually sign up there and have some very basic VTN functionality available. Again, this is not a full test tool or anything, but it gives some initial ideas if stuff is working. And then the OpenADR Alliance itself, we had for 2.0 A and B connected with Quality Logic, and have a test tool which is identical to the test tool that all of our authorized test houses use. And members of the Alliance can purchase that tool and then use that as well during their development. So this is not a must-have; it's an optional purchase. And if you do go down the road of building the products yourself, it may be valuable and maybe save you in the end time and money, even though you have to purchase the tool. So
And Rolf, maybe one thing I'll add there, and I know we're just a few minutes here until we're going to close. So Codibly certainly can support with some of this, and we do have some existing tools as well in our arsenal. And we also partner with Grid Fabric. So those were when I was talking about more of the quick license model versus the code base with potential strategic extension opportunities model. Those are offered between Codibly and Grid Fabric in partnership. So if you have interest in exploring either of those two options and understanding which of those might make the most sense for your business, we can certainly have a follow-up conversation about that. And I can dive into the pros and cons based on individual OEMs priorities, because it is an important decision and definitely does have some ramifications for what you are looking at strategically for the future. And I think that also, just looking ahead in the questions, probably answers Tristan's question as well, that Rolf, unless you know of one, I'm not aware of a website that lists all the companies that can act as a third-party resource within this space. Certainly, Codibly has a pretty good sense of some of the major players, and we do partner with many of those players, as I've mentioned. So Tristan, I mean, happy to follow up with you offline if that's of interest, and can give you a little bit of a lay of the land. But I don't know as there's a website or a list of those resources that would mention all of those potential partners. But Rolf, maybe you guys have something yourself. I'm not sure.
yeah, so only to some extent. I mean, obviously, we list some developer resources on the website. So if you kind of skim through how to build a product and things like that, there's Codibly, there's Grid Fabric, and so on as resources. But yeah, this is by no means, I think, a comprehensive list there. So, quick, I think time maybe for one last question here. We have a few more. There is actually good some good stuff coming, but we will answer that offline. But quickly again, the slides will be shared on our website. Give me a couple of days to bring them online there. Spencer, quick call for you to send me the latest and greatest
Yeah, yeah,
as a PDF or so. And the second part of the question from Joris was then the legislation for water heaters is separate, but is the OpenADR standard the same? And I guess the answer there is yes. There's really only one version of the OpenADR standard to implement.
yep. And just to reiterate there, so yeah, the California Energy Commission has currently released this pool control device coverage with the standard that they've released for September. And like I mentioned, they're working on additional standards that would cover these different devices, water heaters being one of them, that will be released in the coming months. And so yes, those will be separate and probably will have some different requirements. But OpenADR would be implemented, I guess, implemented once and could be used multiple ways in the future without an entirely new implementation.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much again, Spencer. Thanks for folks for dialing in. A great number of people on here today. So I hope it was valuable. And as we said, the slides as well as the recording will be posted on our website. And hopefully I manage it before the follow-up email goes out tomorrow. It depends a little bit on the speed of my connection here at the hotel I'm currently at. So thanks again, Spencer. And I'm sure we'll talk soon.
Okay. Thanks everyone for dialing in, and have a nice day.
Take care.
Bye bye.